He had sent for a wife the way a man sends for a new axle or a sack of seed. It was a practical matter, a line item in the ledger of survival. The advertisement promised a respectable woman of good character, and in return for passage and board, she would be his wife. He expected a pair of hands for the cooking and mending, a quiet presence to satisfy the homesteading laws that favored a married man. He did not expect the woman who stepped out of the carriage into the brutal glare of the afternoon sun, a slash of dark red silk in a world of dust and bleached wood. She was small, fine-boned, and held her head at an angle that was not defiance, but an unshakable, private dignity. In one hand, she carried a single, dark brown suitcase, its leather corners scuffed and worn from a journey that had crossed an ocean and a continent. Amos Blackwood was a giant of a man, built of long bone and hard muscle, his silence as vast as the plains around them. He stood on the boardwalk, a mountain in faded denim, and watched her approach. He had been told her name was Unmai. He did not say it. He merely nodded, the gesture curt, and took the heavy suitcase from her grasp. It was heavier than it looked. "The wagon is this way," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones moving deep underground. Unmai said nothing. She simply inclined her head and followed him, her steps measured and silent in her soft-soled shoes. The townsfolk stared. They saw the giant rancher who had buried both his parents last fall, and the impossible, doll-like woman in a dress the color of wine and embers. They saw a bargain of desperation, a curiosity. Unmai saw only the back of the man who was now her husband, a wall of faded blue cotton that blocked out the sun. She felt the heat rising from the dirt street, a dry, predatory heat she had never known. The air smelled of dust, horse, and something else, something like baked emptiness. Her hand tightened on the small, hidden packet of seeds in her pocket, a tiny anchor to a world that no longer existed for her. This was her new life. A giant, a patch of dust, and a single brown suitcase that held everything she had left. The ride to the ranch was made in a silence that felt heavier than her suitcase. Amos handled the team with an economy of motion, his large hands gentle on the reins. Beside him, his younger sister Martha sat rigid, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She was perhaps 15, with Amos's height in her frame and a raw, defensive anger in her eyes. She had not said a word of greeting, had only stared at Unmai with open hostility. Unmai did not try to speak. She watched the landscape unfold, a vast, sun-scorched canvas of brown and pale yellow, the sky a pitiless, empty blue. It was a hungry-looking land. The farmhouse was much like the man, solid, spare, and weathered. It was clean, scrubbed bare, but a deep loneliness clung to the walls. It was in the way the second rocking chair on the porch sat perfectly still, and in the stark arrangement of the main room, which held a table, 3 chairs, and little else. Grief was the fourth resident of this house, an invisible presence that took up all the air. Amos set her suitcase down just inside the door. He gestured to a small room off the main living space. It contained a narrow bed with a patched quilt and a small, empty wardrobe. "This is yours," he stated. He did not say our room. The line was drawn. He turned back to the main room, his shadow falling long across the floorboards. "You cook. You clean. The house is yours to run. The well is out back. The woodpile is there." He pointed through the open door. "Martha will show you the larder." It was not a welcome. It was a list of duties. Unmai gave a small, formal bow of her head. It was more than she'd had. It was shelter. It was a start. Her gaze fell on her suitcase. She did not unpack it. She pushed it against the wall beside the door of her new room, a silent testament that this arrangement was conditional, that her belonging was not yet earned. It sat there as a reminder of how quickly everything could be swept away. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a scruffy, one-eyed barn cat appeared at the kitchen door, its gaze cynical. It watched her for a long moment, then gave a short, demanding meow. Unmai looked from the cat to the silent man and his silent sister, and understood this was the only welcome she was likely to get. Unmai began her work the next morning before the sun had fully risen. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was its own language. There were no grand gestures, just an accumulation of small, deliberate acts. One small thing at a time. The house was already clean, but she aired out the quilts and blankets, letting the fierce sun bake the lingering scent of sickness and sorrow from them. She swept the porch, her broom making a soft, rhythmic shushing sound in the pre-dawn stillness. Her first meal for them was a revelation. The larder was sparse, holding flour, beans, and salted pork. But Anmai had seen the wild, hardy herbs growing near the creek bed, plants the Blackwoods had always considered weeds. She stewed the beans with slivers of pork and these strange greens, and the result was a fragrant, savory dish that tasted of more than just subsistence. Amos ate his portion without a word, his expression unreadable. But he cleaned his plate. Martha picked at hers, suspicious. "My mother used to just boil the beans," she said, the words a small, sharp stone thrown into the silence. Anmai did not reply. She simply ate her own small portion, her eyes downcast. In the following days, she continued her quiet transformation of the household. She found Amos's work shirts, the cuffs frayed and the elbows worn thin. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, a nearly invisible web that gave the tired fabric new life. She organized the larder, her precise arrangements creating an illusion of plenty from scarcity. And in a small, protected patch of earth behind the house, she turned the soil. From the precious, all-cloth-wrapped packet she had carried across the world, she planted her seeds. Strange, wrinkled seeds for melons that could grow in sand, and tiny black seeds for a leafy green that thrived in heat. She watered them with the dishwater she saved, every drop precious. Amos would see her from a distance, a small figure in a borrowed apron, kneeling in the dirt. He noticed the better bread, the repaired tack, the way the house was beginning to feel less like a tomb. He said nothing. But the silence in the house was changing. It was still quiet, but it was no longer the dead quiet of despair. It was becoming a quiet of observation. Martha was the last bastion of the old misery. She circled Anmai with the wary energy of a half-wild colt, ready to shy at any sudden move. She was the keeper of her mother's memory, and she saw every new dish, every mended shirt, as a betrayal. "My mother kept the flour in a bin, not in sacks," she would declare. Or, "We always used the blue-flowered plates for supper," and Anmai would simply nod and continue her work. She never argued, never defended. Her patience was a smooth, unbreachable wall against which Martha's adolescent anger repeatedly broke. The turning point came on a blistering afternoon. Martha was helping Jessie, the lanky, quiet ranch hand, fix a section of broken fence. Her hand slipped, and the sharp edge of a stray wire sliced deep into her palm. She came into the house, white-faced, blood-welling and dripping onto the floorboards. "It's nothing," she insisted, her voice tight with bravado. Amos was miles away, checking on the herd. Anmai took one look at the wound and moved. She sat Martha down, her touch gentle but firm. She washed the cut with clean water, then went to the small herb garden she was tending. She returned with a few crushed leaves, dark green and pungent. She made a poultice and bound it tightly to Martha's hand with a clean strip of cotton. "It will sting," Anmai said softly. It was one of the few full sentences she had spoken to the girl. It did sting, but within minutes, the deep, throbbing ache began to subside. By evening, the swelling was down. The next day, the cut was clean and already beginning to heal, with none of the angry red that usually followed such wounds. Martha looked at her hand, then at Anmai, who was kneading dough at the kitchen table. The hostility in the girl's eyes was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. That afternoon, she walked out to the garden. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the strange, spiker-leaf plant Anmai had used. Anmai told her its name, a word that sounded like music and stone. From that day on, Martha's questions changed. They were no longer challenges, but requests. "Can you show me how you do that stitch? What are those melons called?" The house was still quiet, but now, it was a quiet that listened. Even Jessie, who rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time, started tipping his hat to Anmai when he saw her. Trust was being won, one small, silent act at a time. The quiet reciprocity began in objects, not words. One morning, and Mai went to move her suitcase and found the handle, which had been frayed and threatening to break, was no longer damaged. It had been carefully repaired, wrapped in a new, supple piece of dark leather, the stitching wide but strong. It was Amos's work. She knew the look of his stitches from the saddles he mended in the barn. He had done it in the dead of night, a silent acknowledgement of the one object that symbolized her tenuous position. He had fortified her means of leaving, a gesture that paradoxically made her feel more rooted. A few days later, another change. Mai owned a single, fine porcelain teacup, thin and delicate, that she had carried in her luggage. Each morning, she would drink her tea from it while Amos had his coffee from a thick ceramic mug. One morning, she came to the table to find her cup already there, set beside his. He was pouring hot water into it from the kettle. He did not look at her, did not say a word, but the message was clear. A second place was being made. It was into this fragile, thawing piece that Mr. Davies arrived. He was the banker from town, a man whose clothes were too fine for the dust, his smile too smooth. He rode up in a polished buggy, tying it to the rail with a flourish. "Amos, my boy," he said, clapping Amos on the shoulder. "Just checking in. Worried about you out here." With this heat his eyes swept the property, a quick, calculating glance that missed nothing. He nodded politely to Mai, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "And the new bride," he said, his tone laced with a faint, dismissive pity. "Another mouth to feed, I suppose." "Times are hard enough." He and Amos spoke on the porch for a long time, Davies's voice a low, concerned murmur, Amos's responses clipped monosyllables. And Mai stayed inside, but she heard the words note, overdue, and drought. Later that week, while tidying the small, roll-top desk that had belonged to Amos's father, her fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound ledger. She could not read the English script, but she understood columns of numbers. As she dusted the cover, a page fell open. Near the bottom, a sum had been aggressively circled in faded ink. Beside it was a question mark. She traced the numbers. Then she remembered a notice from the bank that Amos had left on the mantelpiece. She held the memory of the two sets of figures in her mind. They were not the same. Something was wrong. The summer deepened its hold, a malevolent presence that leached the color from the sky and the life from the land. The sun was a hammer, beating down day after day. The creek that bordered the Blackwood property slowed to a muddy trickle and then vanished, leaving a cracked, sun-baked scar. The water level in the well dropped daily, each bucket hauled up seeming shallower than the last. The grass in the pastures turned to dry, brittle straw, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like hoops on a barrel. Amos was a ghost, gone before dawn and back after dusk, his face a grim mask of dirt and exhaustion. He spent his days hauling water from a distant spring and searching for any patch of grazing he might have missed, fighting a losing battle against the sky itself. The mood in the house grew tense. Hope became a rationed commodity, like water. Yet, in the midst of this slow-motion disaster, one small patch of green thrived. Mai's garden, tucked in the meager shade of the house, was an oasis of defiance. The strange, pale melons she had planted swelled on their vines, and the tough, dark leafy greens grew with a stubborn persistence. She had known this kind of heat, this kind of thirst. She watered the plants with the grey water from washing dishes and clothes, an act of radical economy that Martha had first found strange but now understood. The garden was not just a curiosity anymore. It was their survival. As the weeks wore on and the larder dwindled, the stews she made were filled with the garden's bounty. The crisp, watery flesh of the melons was their only sweetness, their only relief from the oppressive heat. Amos would come in from the fields, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and find a plate of food that tasted of life. He still said nothing, but he would watch her as she moved about the kitchen, a quiet, unyielding force against the vast, consuming drought. One evening, with the air still thick and hot long after sunset, Martha found Mai in her garden, gently turning the soil around the base of a plant. The girl had grown quieter in recent weeks, her youthful certainty eroded by the harsh reality of their situation. "How did you know?" Martha asked, her voice soft. "How did you know to plant these things?" Nothing else is growing, and Mai continued her work for a moment, her hands moving with practiced care. She sat back on her heels and looked not at Martha, but out at the parched land stretching away into the twilight. "My home," she began, her English slow, each word carefully chosen. "Sometimes, the rain does not come." For a long time she paused, searching for the right phrasing. "We learn what grows with no water. Or we do not eat." She then told a story, not for sympathy, but as a simple statement of fact. She spoke of a village, of a dry season that stretched into a year, of the desperation that followed. She described watching her own mother do what she was doing now, saving every drop of water, cultivating plants that others deemed weeds, finding nourishment where it seemed none could exist. She spoke of hunger not as an abstract concept, but as a physical presence, a cold ache in the belly that taught lessons no book ever could. Her story was spare, unadorned with emotion, but it explained everything. It explained her habit of taking the smallest portion. It explained her meticulous care with every grain of flour. It explained her silence, which was not emptiness, but the trained composure of a survivor. Martha listened, and for the first time, she saw Mai not as a replacement for her mother, but as a woman forged in a fire she could barely imagine. Later, she repeated the story to Amos, and the great, silent man finally began to understand the true nature of the woman who now shared his roof. Mr. Davies chose his moment perfectly. He arrived when the ranch was at its lowest ebb, the cattle gaunt and the well dangerously low. This time, his polished buggy seemed like an insult. He did not bother with pleasantries, his smile from the previous visit completely gone, replaced by a mask of grim, professional regret. He stood on the porch with Amos, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "I'm sorry, Amos," he said, his voice carrying the false weight of sympathy. "The bank has been more than patient. But this drought, your note is simply too far in arrears." He gestured vaguely at the desolate landscape. "This land is killing you. It killed your father, trying to hold on to it." He let the cruel words hang in the air before pressing his advantage. "My offer still stands. It's a fair price. More than fair, under the circumstances. Enough to pay your debts and start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere with more rain." His eyes flickered toward the house, where Mai was standing in the doorway, listening. He saw her small garden, a patch of defiant green in the overwhelming brown. "Growing weeds won't pay the bills, son," he said, his voice hardening slightly. The threat was no longer veiled. It was calm, it was reasonable, and it was absolute. Amos stood like a statue, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trapped. The land was his only inheritance, the sum of his father's life and his own. To lose it was to fail them completely. The despair rolled off him in waves, so thick it was almost visible in the shimmering heat. He said nothing, but his silence was the sound of a man breaking. Mai watched him, her own expression unreadable, her mind working, connecting the polite man from the first visit to the predator standing before her now. That night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Mai waited until Martha and a silent, defeated Amos were asleep. Then she lit a single candle and went to the old desk. She retrieved the ledger and the foreclosure notice Davies had left. The numbers swam before her eyes, a language she was only beginning to understand. She needed help. The next day, she approached Martha, holding the ledger. "For my English," she said, her voice soft. "Please read the words for me." A wary but willing, Martha sat with her at the kitchen table. Mai would point to a column header, and Martha would read, "Date. Payment. Interest. Balance." Mai copied the English words onto a scrap of paper, then copied the columns of numbers from the ledger and the bank's notice side by side. Slowly, painstakingly, a story of theft began to emerge. The interest rate on the bank's notice was nearly double what was recorded in her father-in-law's careful script. There were service fees and drought surcharges, phantom costs that appeared out of nowhere and compounded with predatory speed. "What is this word?" Mai asked, pointing to a notation in the old ledger. "Discrepancy," Martha read. "It means, something is wrong." A mistake. As she put the ledger away, and Mai's fingers brushed against something tucked deep within its pages, a folded, yellowed letter. It was a copy of a letter Amos's father had written to the bank. In it, he politely but firmly questioned the very same fees and interest calculations that were now being used to ruin his son. The letter was dated 2 weeks before the fever had swept through the valley and taken him. And Mai carefully folded the letter and placed it with her neatly copied columns of figures. She looked at her work, the quiet, damning evidence. Then her eyes went to the brown suitcase that still stood by her door. It had been her anchor, her escape plan. Now, it felt like a question. Was this a fight she could win? Or was this a house built on sand, ready to be washed away? For the first time, the thought of leaving felt not like a relief, but like a loss. Mr. Davies did not come alone. He arrived 2 days later with the town sheriff, a tall, weary-looking man named Peterson. The banker's demeanor was somber, official. This was the end. Amos met them on the porch, his face pale beneath its layer of sun and dust. He looked like a man already condemned, his shoulders slumped, the fight gone out of him. Martha stood just inside the doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Amos," Davies said, his voice pitched for the sheriff's benefit. "I am truly sorry it has come to this." He held out the final foreclosure papers. At that moment, the screen door creaked open. Mai stepped out onto the porch. She was not wearing her red cheongsam, but a simple work dress. She was not holding a weapon. In her hands, she held several sheets of paper and the old ledger. She walked past her husband, her expression serene, and stopped not before Davies, but before Sheriff Peterson. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. "Sheriff," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Please." She laid the papers out on the porch railing, a makeshift table. With one steady, slender finger, she pointed to a column of figures she had copied. "This number," she said clearly. "From his father's book." Then she pointed to the corresponding column on the bank's foreclosure notice. "This number." From the bank. She paused, letting the lawman's eyes follow her finger. "They are not the same." She then produced the folded letter. "His father wrote to the bank," she said, handing it directly to the sheriff. "He asked about the numbers. Then, he was gone." Davies began to bluster, sputtering about complicated finances and a farmer's ignorance. But Sheriff Peterson was not looking at him. He was looking at the evidence laid bare. The clear, methodical columns Mai had drawn. The damning letter. The stark difference between the two sets of books. It was not a complex fraud, but a simple, brutal one, preying on grief and isolation. The sheriff slowly folded the papers and tucked them into his coat. He looked from the evidence to Davies's sweating, florid face, and his own expression hardened. "I think," he said, his voice flat, "that you and I need to ride back to town, Mr. Davies. We have a lot to discuss at my office." They left. The dust from their departure settled. The threat, which had hung over the ranch like a thunderhead, had simply evaporated into the hot, dry air. On the porch, there was only silence. Amos turned and looked at his wife. He did not see the mail-order bride, the foreign woman, the extra mouth to feed. He saw the person who had quietly, methodically saved him. He saw her strength, her intelligence, her unyielding core of honor. His gaze moved from her face to the old brown suitcase, still sitting just inside the door where he had left it months ago. "Mai," he said. It was the first time he had said her name with anything more than politeness. It now held a different weight entirely. "That belongs in our room now." It was not a flowery declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. A place had been made. Belonging was no longer conditional. Mai looked up at the giant, weary man, and for the first time, a true, slow smile reached her eyes, lighting them from within. "Yes," she said. The suitcase would finally be unpacked. Thank you for watching.